Gabriel. Hey, congratulations on your film, Attachment.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So let's start off with this. Where did you get the idea, the original for this original story for Attachment?
Yeah, for sure. So it had sort of 2 points of origin. So bear with me because it's like a long answer to that question. But like one of them is I'd grown up watching so many amazing, great horror films that would draw on a lot of like Christian, especially Catholic, like mythology and tradition and dogmas and things like that. Um, And the thing I loved, and to this day I love about this movie, was how like even the darkest ones are always really playful. Like they sort of take the bits of the religion and the tradition that works for the story, and then they bend it and fill in the blanks with
Mhm.
the stuff that they make up to just to for the purposes of their story and to make the story work. And I always thought that was such a fun and liberating approach to something like that. And being a Jew, I had never really seen anyone do that with the Jewish mythologies and the Jewish sort of like mystical traditions. And I always thought it was a shame because I mean, there's a lot of amazing Jewish cinema out there, but sort of aside from a lot of comedies, there tends to be, for many, many good reasons, a lot of reverence towards the religion, a lot of reverence towards the culture. And I kind of wanted to see some of that, like while not being in any way sort of disrespectful, to have that playfulness. Like, yeah, this is a really fun thing. If we tweak it and bend it and do something else, we can make a really fun love story. Sorry, horror story, or in this case, also love story. Um, and so I wanted to tap into that playfulness in horror that I'd seen and do it with Judaism, but I didn't have a specific story to kind of latch that onto. Um, and then sort of mid 2018, so Josephine, who plays Maya, who plays the lead in the film, is one of my closest friends. We've been friends since high school, and we used to do really, really bad theater together back in the day. And then she and I went out right after she finished drama school, and I was wrapping up film school. Uh, she and I went out and got very drunk, and then she told me these really funny stories that she hadn't told me before about an ex-girlfriend of hers and how she and the ex had sort of just happened to both be between apartments for like a month or so, and the ex was like, "Hey, why don't we just move in with my mom for a bit? Like, she's got room, it'll be chill, it'll be fun. We can stay there until everything works out." And so they did, and it was not chill at all. It was really intense and crazy. And the stories she told me were so funny because they were so over the top and outrageous. And just in my absolute like kind of drunkenness, I was like, I am going to write you a movie about this, and I'm going to make you a star, and it's going to be great. And Josephine subsequently did go on to become a star, and I had absolutely nothing to do with it. But I like that idea really stuck with me. I was like, this is a fun premise. This would be a really fun way to work with Josephine. I'm not sure what to do with it. And then the Jewish kind of like that feeling of wanting to be in that Jewish world and that mystical tradition came back. And I started to think about the trope of the Jewish mom and how Jewish mothers are always kind of depicted as being really overbearing and over the top. And I was like, oh man, that like domineering, overbearing feeling that everything is always a matter of life or death. Wouldn't it be fun to make a movie where, unbeknownst to most of the people, including the audience, it really is a matter of life or death? All the stupid shit that seems like overreactions are really serious. And once that idea came to me, and I was like, oh, that works really well with this idea of these three women in a house together. Um, and I had to discard the specific stories that Josephine told me. And I think that she's grateful for that. I mean, they didn't really work with the Jewishness of it all, but also now, she's not getting angry phone calls from her ex's mom because, she can't really identify herself in it. Um, but this as a structure, those three women in that house together, and with this idea of like the Jewish mom trope being subverted and how that could tie in with the Jewish mythology, somehow it kind of all clicked into place, and that became the film.
I do have to hand it to you that the three characters that you actually presented, are far reaching, but far interesting because of the persistence and the secrets that they're just circling around
Great.
each other throughout the entire film.
Yeah, no, I mean that was like a big that was a really fun thing to talk about when both when we had very limited rehearsal time, but what time we had, we spent a lot about talking about that. And also, it's a really fun. It was a real. Those were really fun scenes to direct, and I think to act as well, because it gives you the opportunity to go like, okay, well, if this is what you're not giving away, right? Like, let's do it where you're trying to hide it this way. Now let's do it a version where we play it as though you have no idea about this thing. And then let's do a version where you think you know exactly what's going on. And you could play with all these different, the fact that there were so many things that were going unsaid meant that you could take every scene and play it in 5 different ways. And it would still kind of weirdly work and cut together, even if you switch between those moods. And that was a really, it was a very liberating way to work, because it always meant, even on just like the basic level of how a take would be, that we'd never have to get the one take that nailed it all. Because the fun of it was, well, each take we can try to approach these misunderstandings and these secrets in a slightly different way. And so there was never the heaviness of, are we getting exactly what we need? It's like, what else can we do now? And that was a super fun way to work. All because you had this font of secrecy and distrust that you could draw on all the time.
Now, how did you balance it's almost like 2 storylines, because first of all, it's like a lesbian love story, and then you have a Jewish horror. I mean, how do you want to, balance those two? Because I do have to hand it to you. If I ever thought of a, lesbian love story Jewish horror, this is the film. I can't
I deeply appreciate that. Well, I mean, I think, to be honest, a lot of it just came from the way that the idea came together, like, it's a lesbian love story because, well, that was one of the sources of the inspiration, right? And like, it was, I drew on stories from a queer relationship told by a queer actor that I was writing the film for. Like, seemed a little bit unnecessary to go in and change that part of it. And that was the structure that at the same time worked so well with a lot of the kind of the Jewish tropes that I wanted to work with. And so I think, because maybe it's just because of my broken brain, but like that, it felt like a very natural, it all kind of weirdly felt naturally cohesive in my mind. So it was less about the sort of, balancing the lesbian, like the queer aspect, and the Jewish aspect wasn't that much of a challenge, other than, well, obviously in the real world, it might be tricky for a community like that to kind of make that room for that relationship. But at the same time, who knows? Like, it seems hard, but it might be. And also, secondly, as the Jew in that constellation, I was like, I am part of what I wanted to do with this is to bend a lot of the realities about the sort of, traditions and things like that, and take the things that work and don't work. So I'm going to just bend it a little bit more to make that room. And then that was that. And that was kind of a decision that was made while I was writing The Treatment, and it never really came up again after. In terms of what actually was tricky to balance is more the genre pieces of it. Like, I wanted it to feel almost like a romantic comedy to begin with a meet cute and everything. And then to get it into something that was more kind of psychologically unsettling, and then have a third act that felt more like an outright kind of horror film. Like, it was really, I wanted it to have those pieces together. Partly because they're just all genres I love, and because I kind of set out making the film with this theory that, like, if it's fundamentally a love story, as long as it never stops feeling like a love story, you can probably do a lot more in terms of genre and mood switches than you'd think. Like, as long as you feel like what everyone is doing, they're doing out of love, and each of those actions results in the film bending more into one genre or the other, then it might actually, you could maybe pull it off. Mm-hmm. And so that was, but that was a lot of, that was a lot of work in the writing, a lot of work when we were shooting and trying different things to figure out when the tonalities changed for the better or the worse. And then the editing, again, because of the way that we approached a lot of the material, I was fortunate enough to have all these different options that never felt like we were covering our bases, but just like they were like different flavors of the same feeling. But having those different flavors meant that we could always tweak the scenes to go in one direction or the other. And so it took a lot of time and work, but it was really fun and gratifying to make those genre bends work.
Absolutely. Now, you being Danish yourself, and this is an English film, I guess it wasn't really a debate on whether to make this an English film or a Danish film. You're an English filmmaker because I just found it unusual because obviously Josephine is a Danish actress,
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
this was a setting in London, you know.
Well, I think that so the reason that it's in English, I mean, I am Danish, and I also spent all of my the entirety of my 20s and then some living in the UK and the US, and living in London, New York. So, you know, I write as comfortably, if not more comfortably, in English. I consider myself like fairly fully bilingual. But in terms of the film, it is unusual. The reason what's unusual about it really is that because I'm fortunate enough that as a Danish citizen, I have access to the Danish Film Institute and the Danish public film financing. And the Danish Film Institute has an amazing scheme called New Danish Screen, which specifically is set up to finance first features to help like recently graduated film school directors get a first feature made and just try their hand at it. And that's how this film was financed. And also, when you apply for Danish film financing, it is, you know, usually it is expected to be a Danish language film unless there's a really good reason for it. But in this case, the reason was pretty organic, which is that like Denmark does not have a very big Jewish community, let alone an Orthodox one that has those Yiddish traditions that I'm drawing on, sort of oral and culturally. And so I was like, well, I need to set it somewhere where there is a community that I can like, as fictionalized as it is, this kind of community exists. And it doesn't exist in Denmark, so we'd have to have left Denmark anyway. And then it was a matter of, well, I've only lived in two cities where they exist, and they exist in London, they exist in New York. And London was just realistically, that was something we could do. And so that's how it became London.
Wow, and most excellent. Now, in the case for the Jewish traditions in that you presented in your film, how true is it to the traditions, and how much you actually have to fictionalize?
Lots of fictionalized, but all with inspiration from real stuff. So like the most, you know, without giving away too much, there is a book in the film, for instance, that I made up, but the things depicted in it are not, with one exception. Like the creatures and the traditions depicted are not. The term that's on the book is something that is a real term, shadra. The writer is a reference to a Yiddish writer called Esa Ansky, who wrote a famous play called Dybbuk. There is also a ritual that is in the book and is in the film that I made up, but it is drawing from elements that are described in that Ansky play, Dybbuk. Mm-hmm. And that, I mean, I could go through everything in the film and kind of go over, but like that is a pretty good sort of sense of what I did. Is like everything is in there. I'm drawing on something, and also I am, because that was part of what I want to do with it, kind of bending it to the will of the story I want to tell, mm-hmm. And taking the bits that I think work and then discarding a bunch that doesn't. And I was inspired by that, partly by a lot of great Yiddish and Jewish art that would do the same. You know, like I feel like that's part of what's fun about these cultural traditions, is that there rarely is an text that everyone goes back to and follows slavishly. Everyone takes the last bit that they saw or read or heard, and it's like, oh, that's fun. I'm just going to tweak it because the story might be a little better if I do this, or for my purposes, I'll do this. And that is what is great about cultural traditions. And so this was my humble attempt to write myself into what is like a really great, amazing tradition of Jewish folklore and storytelling, by taking the bits and pieces I thought were the most fun and then kind of running with them.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of movies, and you know, the Jewish horror folklore is plenty. I mean, the Golem, Dybbuk. I mean, I just saw a film about the eater of children and all this kind of stuff. Is going,
yeah.
Gosh, there is a lot of Jewish folklore that's horrifying.
There is, and also the thing that I think is so wonderful about it is that a lot of it's also really funny. Like the single biggest inspiration on this film was a short story by the writer Isaac Bashevis Singer, he's Polish, emigrated to America, but he came from like the shtetls, from like the Yiddish speaking villages in Eastern Europe, and then he emigrated to the U.S. and lived on the Lower East Side, and he wrote these beautiful, fun stories. Some of them were more realistic than others, but they were always incredibly sweet and heartwarming in a weird way, and really, really trippy. And one of them is a story called The Dead Fiddler, which is about a young woman gets possessed by a dybbuk, and starts out really horrifyingly in the descriptions of her body and what it does. Like, it's really gross and intense. Then she gets possessed by a second dybbuk. And then it becomes like a weird double black where the dybbuks are just arguing over each other and really not getting along. And then the rabbi gets an idea of like, wait, what if I get the two dybbuks to fall in love? And he does. And then what if I marry them? And he does. And then their honeymoon is the exorcism. And that to me was perfectly like so odd and strange, but so sweet at the same time. And it starts so horrifically. And all those tonal changes all weirdly work at the same time. And when I read that while I was doing research, I was like, that's it. That's what I want to do. That is the feeling I want this film to have.
I can't imagine you putting Ellie through all of that with another dybbuk.
I mean, a lot of what we did to Ellie in it was from that story as well. I kind of took like a lot of the descriptions, like, oh, we should do this to her. This is going to be really messed up.
That is great. So for yourself, do you have a love of this horror genre, or do you?
I do. I love horror films. So I grew up in film. Both my parents are in film, and I had a grandmother who was not in film. She was like a public school teacher, but she loved film so much that I messed up my shoulder when I was 7 from trying to. She'd show me Singing in the Rain, and I wanted to do what Donald Connor does when he runs up the wall, and I messed up my shoulder as a 7-year-old for that reason. I grew up with films everywhere, but horror was the genre I got to discover on my own, and at a pretty young age, and I was just obsessed with it. And I think the thing that even now, as I'm older, I really love about it is it's not so much the conventions of it, it's the form, it's the mood, it's the tone, it's the way that it can elevate the stakes, but also it's just such a cinematic genre. Like, it uses the basic building blocks of cinema, which is, I know this sounds kind of pretentious, but I really feel this way. Like, the basic building blocks of cinema is like, where is the camera and when, and where are the cuts and when? Like, what are you showing and what are you not showing and when? And there are a few genres that rely so entirely on it than horror. And so as someone who loves film, it's a really satisfying genre to work in, because you get to ask yourself those questions all the time. You have to, or it won't work. Like, it'll live or die by those terms.
Now, one more thing about this film, people would notice is as a horror film, this is I want to say a bloodless horror film, but
yeah,
but it is frightening. It is scary. It's the way how you use your shadows and camera work. Tell us about the decision of making this a bloodless horror film.
Well, I think, again, just, in terms of like, I don't think that horror is interesting if you look at it at convention, but I don't think any genre is, right? I don't think genres are helpful to look at as a set of conventions. I think they're helpful as a form, again, as a mood, as a way to elevate the stakes. And once you kind of look at genres like that, horror doesn't have to have blood, right? And to me, a great horror film horror has the capacity to be anything. In this case, I really wanted it to be, more than anything, a love story, and I wanted it to feel tender. And I don't think that horror in any way works against that, because tenderness also comes from stakes, right? So the higher the stakes, the more you get that yearning for like a feeling of love and connection between the characters if you render them well. And that's what I was hoping to do with this. Most
excellent. So what's up next with you?
2 other projects in development. One of them with the Danish Film Institute again. That is, they've kindly commissioned a draft of me that I'm a little bit behind on, but wrapping up. Once we leave this, I'm going to go back to writing. And then I have another film, which is an American script that is I've just developed as a spec, and I'm slowly sending out into the world. So I'm not going to talk too much about it, but it's kind of a riff on a haunted house movie, and who knows? It'd be lovely if something happened with it.
Most excellent. Well, I appreciate your conversation with us for Attachment, and I'm glad you kept Josephine all the way from start to the end throughout this entire project. So this is terrific for you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and thank you for talking to me. It's a pleasure.
Hey, thank you. Next time. Thank you.
All right. Bye.